Ultramarine Blue is a true workhorse color. It's one of the reasons I have so few colors on my palette. In this video, I'll show you 6 essential color mixing formulas that I use in almost all of my paintings. With Ultramarine, I can mix black, purple, gray, brown, and natural looking greens. Let's start with how I mix brown. One of my favorite recipes for mixing brown is to start with red and then add a tiny amount of Ultramarine Blue. A little bit makes it a darker red, but as you add more, it turns brown. This is a good color for the dark shadows on an apple or any other dark red object. I could try adding a little bit more just to get a darker brown. If you go too far, it starts to become like a dark blue or like a dullish purple color. But there's a section here where it's more of a brown color. So it's a very simple and quick way to mix brown. Aside from mixing brown, I also use earth colors. The two most popular would be burnt sienna and burnt umber. But if you have ultramarine blue on your palette, you can eliminate burnt umber. So I'll just squeeze some of this out. And for comparison, I'll squeeze out some burnt umber. I'll take some of this burnt sienna, and then I'll add a small amount of the ultramarine blue. If I add enough of it, it will go darker, and it's a pretty close approximation to burnt umber. So here's the burnt umber, and this is what I mixed. I can brush some on some paper and compare these two. So that's the burnt umber. I'll put some on a little bit thicker over here. I washed out my brush, then here's the mixture that I came up with. I might have to lighten it or darken it, but yeah, that's a little too dark. If I add a little bit more of the burnt sienna in there, it's pretty close, maybe a little bit darker. Then I could put a thicker section over here. It's actually not too bad. There's a slight difference, but I would say that would work in most cases. The neat thing about this mixture is if you keep adding ultramarine blue to it, you can mix black. So I would say this is probably the most popular formula for mixing black. Most artists have ultramarine blue and burnt sienna on their palettes. And you just have to get the ratio right. This was a little bit cool, so I added more burnt sienna. And when I scrape it thin like this, you kind of get a sense if it's neutral or not. So if I clean my brush off, I can test it out. This might be a little bit warm. Let's take a look at it on a piece of paper. Maybe a little bit. I could add some more of the blue in there. It's not too bad. I'm going to mix up a little bit more of this because I'm going to use it in the next section. You can see it doesn't really take that long to get to a color that's close to black. And that's why it's popular. The neat thing about this is you could still use black in your painting, but you don't need to carry an extra tube. So just to show you, if I go thicker, that is pretty dark. I'll add some titanium white to my palette, and then I can use it to mix gray. And this is when you can tell if your mixture is neutral or not, because if it leans more towards blue or the burnt sienna, you'll see it. This doesn't look too bad, maybe just a touch of blue, so it's not a bad gray right there. That looks pretty neutral, and sometimes in paintings you do need it to be cooler or warmer, and what you can do is add a little bit of the ultramarine blue to it to make a cool gray. And for a warmer gray, you can add more of the burnt sienna. So I'll just add a touch of that in there, and already it looks much warmer. That might be too much for your taste, and if that's true, you could just balance it back out with some of the ultramarine. So the benefit of mixing grays like this is that you can achieve all these different subtle variations, from warm to cool. I'll brush some of this out on paper and you can get a better comparison. Then I'll dip into the warmer color. And the neat thing is you can dip into either color to adjust it as you go. So there's all these nice subtle different variations of gray. When I mixed the red and blue, you might have thought that it would turn into a vibrant purple. But as you can see here, this purple is pretty muted. And if you want something more vivid, what do you use? My favorite formula for mixing purple is ultramarine blue and quinacridone magenta. So here's the quinacridone magenta. And I recommend this over light magenta or medium magenta because both of those have white in it. And you can get a much deeper purple if you use the quinacridone magenta. So here's quinacridone magenta, and then I'll add some ultramarine blue to it. It starts as like a violet color, but then it gets more purple as you add more blue to it. So this starts to look like dioxazine purple. In fact, I'll compare it. Here's a tube of dioxazine purple. I'll squeeze some of this out and we'll take a look. This cap is stuck, but Golden makes a tube opener. And this has the same notches as what's on the cap. So it gets a really good grip on there. Super easy to open. Here's the purple that I mixed. I'll make it thicker on the end here. I'll wash out my brush, dry it off, and take some of the dioxazine purple. It's a pretty close approximation to dioxazine purple. So if you run out, you can use this mixture. You might be thinking you can mix a purple like this with red, but I made a video where I tried to mix purple from Ultramarine Blue and a bunch of different reds, and they all turn out like this. This is the best way to mix it if you don't have dioxazine purple. The other benefit of this is you can adjust how much magenta is in there. So I can add a little bit more magenta and get a different shade. And then I can add white to it if I wanted to. So the trouble with starting with purple, and let's say you wanted to achieve a color like this, you might dip into the red. And that doesn't really produce the same result. It looks a little bit more brownish. So that's the trouble you run into if you just buy a recolor instead of learning how to mix it. I have an entire course on color mixing. There's a link to it in the description below. Ultramarine Blue is a little bit biased towards magenta. And that makes it really good for mixing natural looking greens. I'll just take a bit of this and mix it over here in the corner. This is benzimidazolone yellow medium. And that makes a much duller green than you would get if you were to use something like phthalo blue or even phthalo green. And you can add more yellow to it to adjust it to whatever you need. So if I compare that to phthalo green, I squeezed out light green permanent and phthalo green. And these are extremely vivid. Light green permanent is actually made from phthalo green. So it's similar, but it's more yellow. I have an entire video about mixing greens, and I show how to mix this in that video. So there are those greens. But then if you wanted to paint something like a landscape, this would look much more natural. And here's the darker version of it. So can you see how that's like an electric green, and that looks more like something you would see in a landscape painting. It's actually pretty close to mixing a sap green. You could just buy this for the convenience of it, but if you want a limited palette, Ultramarine Blue is very useful. Here's a bonus tip. If you're painting landscapes, you're going to need some sort of sky color. And you can use Ultramarine Blue, but sometimes it might be a little bit towards the purple side. So one way to fix that would be to use a little bit of phthalo blue. Might add a little bit more white in here. But if I add a touch of this phthalo blue, can you see how that starts to shift it? Might be hard to see this on the screen, but to my eye, that looks much more purple. Between the ultramarine and the phthalo, you can get a wider variety of blues that you can use in your sky. I have a video about mixing sky blue, and I matched the color of it outside. And the thing is, near the horizon it gets lighter, so you can add more white in there. Ultramarine Blue and phthalo blue are my two most used blues. Hopefully this video will help you to take advantage of Ultramarine Blue. Up next, you can watch my video about how to tame phthalo blue. Thanks for watching.